All right, I guess we will get started, and if folks join later on, I will just let them in. Thank you, everyone. We are here to talk about AI in college apps and admissions and some do's and don'ts. I am Kim, and I'm the founder and CEO of Sharp. We are an SAT prep app and web app. And I, prior to starting Sharp, have spent a lot of time in the tech industry, working at companies like Apple and Airbnb. And I'm a member of the National Test Prep Association, also known as the NTPA, not to be confused with the National Tractor Pulling Association, which is the first Google result you'll see if you type in that acronym. And I'm joined today by the lovely Rachel Lam. Rachel, can you introduce yourself to everyone?
Hi, thanks for the intro, Kim. My name is Rachel Lam. I'm the founder of Prospera Education Consulting. I also have a tech background, unrelated to my background in college admissions, at least on the surface. But I used to work in product marketing at Intuit, which is the wonderful company that brings you QuickBooks and TurboTax, and formerly Mint. And I am a member of the Independent Educational Consultants Association.
ICA, great acronyms. And RIP Mint, I really loved it. And, I had to get my father-in-law onto Monarch Money after it was sunset. All right, so a quick poll, please, everyone in the chat, let us know how have you been using AI in the college process so far, if you've been using it? And which AI, when I say AI, I'm mostly talking about generative AI, so tools like ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude. Curious if anyone has tried using AI for the college process. Gemini and ChatGPT. All right. Have you done anything interesting with them? Copilot and ChatGPT for college lists. Gemini is good. Yeah. Um, Thanks everyone for sharing. Um, we're going to talk a lot more about how you can and how you shouldn't use AI or these generative AI tools for the college process. Okay, so tonight's plan, first, I'm going to give a little bit of a big picture on AI. Then Rachel's going to walk us through how to use these AI tools as part of college planning. Then I'll talk about how to do that, but for test prep, and we'll leave plenty of time at the end for Q&A. If you have questions at any point while we are talking, please just leave those questions in the chat, and then we'll do our best to cover those as part of Q&A.
That's to prep.
Okay. So I want to start off by saying, first and foremost, that AI is a tool and it can be both a gift and a curse. So things have changed a lot in the past few years since ChatGPT and Claude have become really mainstream. And there are ways to use these tools for good, but also ways that you can do a lot of harm. So we wanted to share this up front because we know that kids are using AI more and more, both in high school and in college and beyond. So we know that they're using AI. And we just wanted to share with you some best practices and tips for when and how to use AI wisely, such that it can help you and your family, but not harm their chances in any way. Oh man, sorry about that. All right, Rachel, take it away.
Yeah, so today we're going to start off with where to use AI for college planning, and we're going to do two deep dives. One is going to be suggesting colleges to apply to. One of you have already mentioned building college lists, which is great. And the second is brainstorming topics for your application essays. So let's start off with a prompt for using AI to suggest colleges to you. I'm just going to preamble this by saying that, you know, this may sound obvious, but you cannot go to a college if you don't first apply to it. And so something that's really great that AI can do for your family is to suggest colleges that would be a good fit for your student, beyond what you already know exists out there. And, many of you on this webinar are probably folks who may not qualify for a whole ton of need-based financial aid, but, your student very well may qualify for merit-based financial aid. And so this is where tools such as ChatGPT or Gemini might be really helpful, in terms of suggesting colleges that may not have occurred to you. And so one prompt that you can use and plug into the likes of ChatGPT is as follows, and I'm going to read it for those of you who might be driving or not watching. I am an 11th grader in Southern California. My unweighted GPA is 3.84 and my SAT score is 1380, but I plan to retake it this summer. I'm taking a mix of honors and AP courses. I'm interested in computer science or computer engineering. I would prefer to go to college in California. Suggest some colleges for me to apply to, including ones that may offer me merit aid and include safeties, matches, and reaches. And so before we move on, just notice that here we're not just mentioning like basics of the student's academic profile, but also, where is the student currently located, what preference the students might have for where they go to college, what major that they are interested in, but also like the fact that the student is looking to qualify for merit aid at colleges. Something to also consider, is that if your student has a preference for, let's say, attending a religious college like Boston College or Notre Dame, you can mention that preference in your prompt. If your student is interested in maybe women's colleges or a college that's near a city or a college that has a huge football culture, these are also criteria that can be really helpful to include in this prompt here. I realize now, knowing how many of you guys are from Boston, I probably should have used a more Boston specific prompt, but here we are. And so let's move to the next slide and take a look at what ChatGPT recommended for this hypothetical student, who, by the way, is a composite of many students that I currently work with. Um, so we see all these reaches, you've heard of the vast majority of the colleges on this list. I'll quickly read them. The reaches include UC Berkeley, UCLA, UC San Diego, University of Southern California, and Harvey Mudd College. The matches include UC Davis, UC Irvine, Cal Poly SLO, Santa Clara University, and San Diego State University. The likelies on this list include CSU Long Beach, Cal Poly Pomona, San Jose State, University of San Francisco, and Chapman University. So on the next slide, I have bolded a couple or a few of these schools that people who are not deeply embedded in college admissions or people who are not in higher education might not have heard of. Um, and the reality is that many of the schools that are very, very famous, they're famous for a lot of reasons, including that they churn out a lot of research. But much of the time, these schools are not focused on undergraduate teaching, and yet that is what you are looking for your child. So the quality of undergrad teaching is something to consider when deciding where to send your child to college. And so, um, a school like Harvey Mudd, for example, is a very engineering focused college with about 1,000 undergraduate students, and in fact, 1,000 students in general, located in Southern California. If you look at its website, you will see that it's one of the top engineering programs in the country. And the students get a ton of personal attention because it is such a small college. And it's just something that may not occur to many people to look up because they just simply haven't heard of this school. And so AI can be really helpful for suggesting colleges outside of the ones that you currently know. Um, and again, it's helpful to prompt it to take into consideration different preferences that your student may have, because it also matters how happy your student is during college. That will make it easier for your student to get the outcomes that you're looking for when it comes time for them to graduate and then enter the workforce or continue their studies at grad. Okay, next slide, please. So of course, the schools that are recommended to you by ChatGPT, Gemini, etc., um, are going to what is it? You still need to vet them when you are researching them, and so keep in mind that the tool that you're using to recommend schools to you may have outdated information. And so you just need to be careful to also continue researching the school after it's been suggested. So you may want to read more about the school curriculum, the class sizes, the strength of things like the Career Services Office or the Alumni Network. These are all things to actually research when you hear a school name. And in fact, things that you should research about schools that you have already heard of as well. Next slide, please. And so, how do we do that further research? I already mentioned reading the websites of these colleges, so the admissions page, as well as potentially the websites for the specific majors that your student is interested in. Although you do want to keep in mind that students often do change their major. But the other way that you can get good information about colleges, whether you've heard of them or not, is by speaking directly to admissions personnel. You can do that by visiting those colleges. So, for example, when I say visiting colleges, I do mean signing up for the information session and touring the college and speaking directly to students, speaking directly to the admissions person who is running the information session, but also going to events like college fairs and talking to admissions personnel there as well. So that is using AI for building or having suggestions for your college list. I also want to move on now to using AI for essay brainstorming. And so to give you guys a quick 101 on the personal statement on the Common application, um, the job of the personal statement is an opportunity for the student to speak directly to the admissions office about what is important to them and what they just want the admissions readers to know about them outside of, their grades, what courses they've taken, the activities that they have done, and what their teachers have written about them, because these are the other aspects of the application. And so on the Common application, the essay is about 650 words. And the best ones are going to show the students, core values such as curiosity, resilience, empathy. There are others, but these are common examples. Or how the student persisted through a challenge. Challenges can come in many forms, can come from anything from being cut from the varsity basketball team to overcoming a health issue to, overcoming turmoil at home and finding ways to persist through that. And so those are just examples. They can also give context to the students' academic interests and their extracurricular activities. Oftentimes, students will write about the first time they knew that they were interested in, let's say, STEM and engineering or science, or the first time that they realized that they just wanted to become a doctor. These are simple examples, but these can make for very compelling essays. And finally, every essay needs to show the student's voice, and that's a point that we're going to come back to later on. And so let's now dive into a prompt that you all can use, or that your students can use for brainstorming topics that they can use in their personal statements. And this is actually quite a simple prompt. This is something that any 17-year-old student can pretty easily write. I'll read it for those who are listening. Help me identify what to write my Common App essay about. I am a violist in 3 different orchestras. I work at my parents' Chinese buffet restaurant. I also work at Kumon and as the assistant to a stockbroker. I used to volunteer at a crisis hotline, and I like volunteering in general. My favorite subjects are English, Spanish, and Latin. So notice that again, this is just a student, listing very simply what they spend their time doing. And again, we are not taking their academic transcript into a ton of consideration here, but rather talking about the activities that the student does. And activities are not just the organized club activities or organized sports, but also jobs that the student may take on part-time, or even family responsibilities. Sometimes students just have to like help take care of their grandparents or babysit their siblings, etc. And then the student here also writes that she likes volunteering in general. I'm just going to mention that this student is my high school activities. I just use myself as an example here because that was most easily available to me. But this is something that your students can pretty easily do as well. One thing I really encourage students to do when writing these prompts is to include information that they think is rather boring. And so, for example, working at my mom's Chinese restaurant. Boring, right? Most kids would not find that riveting information about themselves. But I think one thing that Gen AI can be really helpful for is pointing out the obvious things in a student's profile that may not be occurring to the student or even to the parent. Um, and so let's move to the next slide and see what ChatGPT said in response to this prompt. The output were four different ideas. Of course, I'm shortening what the prompt output was because it was quite long, but these are the basic ideas that it gave me. The first was translation as my identity, which is quite interesting because it was talking about translating between cultures, which I found rather interesting, Chinese and American cultures, as well as translation between if anyone is not on mute, I would recommend going on mute just so everyone can continue listening to the webinar. Um, but also translating between different languages, Latin to English, Spanish to English. That was the gist of its first suggestion. The second suggestion was the background role that shapes everything. So the violist's role in the orchestra is usually not to be the melody, the most important part. And so it was drawing from the violist role in an orchestra, but also the role that a person can play working at a restaurant and not being in the literal forefront of the restaurant. So it was, again, drawing connections between my different activities that might not have occurred to me. The third idea that it gave was the story of a moment that changed how I view people between the restaurant, working at the crisis hotline, or at Kumon. For those of you that don't know what Kumon is, it is a tutoring center. Um, and so um, I bolded the word restaurant here because this is actually a suggestion that I resonated with. I was looking at my own high school activities and trying to come up for a different webinar on how I would have advised my high school self on what to write for the Common Application essay. And I do believe that the restaurant would have provided some really compelling content for my Common App essay. I do think that, most teenagers are not necessarily getting a whole lot of experience with customer service, human behavior, entrepreneurship, all those sorts of things. And I think that could have been a really interesting topic for me to write had someone suggested that to me. And so I think this underscores the point that sometimes a really interesting essay topic can be hiding in plain sight. And um, a student just needs like an external force, whether that be AI or another person to point it out to them. The last suggestion that ChatGPT gave was why I love language, but only if done deeply. And it made the very clear point that only that one should only write this essay if they could write it well, which is helpful. All right, next slide. Um, I'm going to state something that hopefully is very obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is do not use AI for writing your essays or editing your essays. The writing your essays, I hope, is the more obvious part. Um, Admissions folks read thousands of essays every year, and they certainly know what sounds like an actual human being wrote it and what sounds like it was written by ChatGPT, Gemini, etc. And so it's not going to reflect well on your student if they don't write their own essay. And every school, treats this differently, but the gist is that, especially at very selective institutions, um, that will get the student disqualified. Um, and so the other item I want to call out is that, I think a lot of people have experience at this point using things like ChatGPT for writing emails. Can't say I blame them. But when it comes to editing college applications essays, the effect that this will have, even though it might make the essay sound prettier on the surface, is that it will make their tone sound very flat. And we don't want that. We do want for students to maintain their voice in the application essay. The imperfection of the writing is often what makes an essay interesting to admissions officers. And so I just want to caution against using it for the editing use case here. One other item to avoid is that I notice a lot of folks spending a lot of time and putting 150% effort into writing their personal statement on the Common Application and then treating the supplemental essays as an afterthought. And the rationale is often that the personal statement is the part of the essay the personal statement is the essay that gets sent to all of the schools that accept the Common Application. The problem is that universities that require a supplemental essay do that because they want the answers to the supplemental essay. Some very common prompts to supplemental essays are, for example, why do you want to come to this school? Or why did you choose the major that you are looking to study? Or some version of, here are our school's values and how do they resonate with you? There are many versions of that, but that's the gist. And so essentially, just know that the schools treat the supplemental essays at least as importantly, if not more important, than the personal statement. So you just want to put a lot of care into writing the supplemental essays. And finally, um, I won't spend too much time on this, but you still do need a human for the vast majority of the college applications process. In addition to holding your student accountable and not procrastinating on the application, the student also needs to build relationships with their teachers and their counselors and the admissions offices themselves in order to have their best shot at getting admitted to some of these very selective schools. And finally, it's really difficult to prompt ChatGPT to know or give a good recommendation for whether you and your family should apply to a school early decision or restricted early action, or whether to submit test scores to certain schools. There are many parts of this process that require tons of nuance. And so it is better to have an actual human giving advice on majority of these topics. And with that, I'll hand it over to Kim to talk about test prep.
Thanks, Rachel. That was really cool and really awesome to hear about, high school Rachel as well and see how you would advise her. So, here to talk about test prep. For folks who joined a little bit later, I'm Kim. I founded Sharp, which is an app to prepare for the SAT and PSAT. I also do one-on-one tutoring, and I'm an expert in this new digital SAT. And like Rachel, I'm going to be sharing some some ways that you can and should use AI for test prep, some ways that you should avoid using it, and times and places where you still definitely need a human in the process. I will also say that we have AI built into Sharp, and I'll be showing a little bit of that. And we make it easier to leverage AI for some of these things, but you also can use ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, you name it, your favorite Gen AI of choice for doing some of these tasks as well. They may just not have all the same information or work quite as well. But some ways that I've seen AI work really well in test prep is for explaining, let's say, why the answer to an SAT question is C, as well as for building a study plan. So we'll walk through those two in a bit more detail. So if you had a question like this one, it's a little bit small, but you can see this is f of x equals 3 over 4x minus 2. What is the value of f of x? There are four answer choices. For almost every single SAT question, it is multiple choice, except 25% of the math questions are actually student-provided response or like free response questions. But in any case, if your student is working on SAT questions, whether in Sharp or in the SAT question bank or taking practice tests from the College Board, if they get a question wrong, they can ask ChatGPT, Gemini, etc., to explain why their answer is wrong or why the correct answer is, a particular answer. So here I have a prompt. It's a bit small, but I'll read it. Act like a top SAT tutor. Guide me step by step without giving the answer right away. At each step, explain the reasoning, what concept is being tested, and how I should recognize the pattern quickly on test day. Point out common mistakes that students make. And here I included a screenshot of the question as well as the answer choices. And I got back a pretty good response. It walked me through how to approach this question and each of the steps, and it got to the correct answer. I'll caveat, like Rachel, that AI can make mistakes and can hallucinate. I will say for SAT style questions, especially when prompted well and it knows the correct answer, it usually does a pretty good job at explaining it. Within Sharp here, I have a screenshot that shows how we build this in. Our AI tutor has, all of the correct answers as well as details and strategies for solving each kind of SAT question. So if a student gets a question wrong when practicing in Sharp, they will get, an explanation right away and one that is 99% of the time quite correct. So the other thing that AI can be really helpful for is creating a study plan. So if you give information like, I am a student, I got this score on a recent Blue Book test, I got, a 700 on math and a 600 on reading writing. I'm taking the test on June 6th. Help me come up with a study plan for how to, get a 1400 plus because I'm applying to very selective universities, etc. Those kinds of things can help AI to give a pretty good plan on how to break down your students' time each week to do practice questions, practice tests, and reviewing their mistakes. And reviewing their mistakes, of course, is a very important part of that process. But the one thing that where that falls short is you get this plan and then your student hopefully implements it. But as they're going through and actually doing practice questions and getting a better sense of the kinds of things they're getting right and wrong, that's something where you want to continue to adapt and update that plan over time. Like if it turns out that your teen is really struggling in, let's say, like quadratics questions in math, that's a case where you would want them to double down and dive deeper and practice more of those questions and not waste time on questions, that they're already really competent at. I'm just going to make sure that everyone is muted. And if you yes, I guess everyone, please make sure you're muted, and we will mute you if you are not. But essentially, like you want to have this loop of coming up with a plan, putting in the practice, reviewing mistakes, and then continuing to adjust that plan. And we've actually built this into Sharp. So we not only come up with a plan for you, but also like once your teen practices in the app, we learn more about their strengths and weaknesses and we adapt that plan over time and show them more of the things that will help them to improve their score. So some things that AI is really bad at, it turns out, are coming up with questions on the fly. If you just ask whether it's ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude, please give me 10 quadratics questions or 10 SAT vocab questions. Those questions, 9 times out of 10 are really, really terrible. I, as an experienced SAT tutor, would not recommend that any student work within one of these chatbots directly for coming up with these questions. I think if a question has been vetted by, an expert, whether it's a teacher or a tutor or someone who's really well versed in the SAT and they've reviewed those and found that those are good, then those questions could be used. But I think because AI can hallucinate and make things up, you don't want your student practicing off of questions that are not representative of what is actually tested on the SAT. Um, to a similar end, I tried Gemini's practice test. I tend to think Gemini is quite good. It is especially strong in math. But they recently released a new SAT product for doing full SAT practice tests and answering questions on that. And those, unfortunately, are really not representative of the SAT. The test has a very predictable format. It does not change. There are 8 available free practice tests in Blue Book from the College Board, which I highly recommend that students take those tests because they're the gold standard on what is out there. But the ones in Gemini, unfortunately, at this point in time, are really not good. So I would steer clear of those. And the last thing to make sure your team doesn't do is use AI as a crutch to outsource their thinking. They won't have it on test day. And so AI, like I said at the beginning, is really just a tool and it can be helpful to be like a sounding board or help explain questions or help come up with a plan. But it is not a replacement for critical thinking, learning how to do math, learning, reading comprehension. These are core skills that students learn in middle school and high school. And, while they're using AI more and more, they still have to actually do the work and put in the time. So this is a little similar to Rachel's slide, but it is still very beneficial to have humans involved in the process for test prep. Um, I I had this happen to me recently where I was always someone who used to work out, and I never understood how people, weren't into working out until I had my first kid. And after that, I'm like, oh, I get it. Like, I really don't feel like working out, and my Peloton just isn't doing it for me anymore. And I worked out recently, and the reason I worked out was because I signed up for a class with an instructor and other people there, and that gave me the accountability and motivation to show up and actually exercise. So I find that test prep can be similar. There's some students who are really self-motivated who, if given the resources, if given the plan, will prepare really well and diligently on their own. And then there's some students who work with me one-on-one who do their work primarily because they're meeting with me on Tuesday and they don't want to show up to a session not having done that, but they show up to a session and they put in that time, and that really helps them to be motivated to improve for this test. Test prep is not always the most exciting or fun thing high school kids could be doing. And so having someone who is well versed and expert in the subject can really help make the difference for them to feel supported through the process. And the last thing I'll say is even though some students may be really self-motivated and work through test prep on their own using something like Sharp or the College Board Question Bank or Khan Academy, those students may still hit score plateaus. So especially ones who are aiming for those really selective colleges and universities, if they're trying to get a top score on this test, it often happens that even really strong students will hit a score plateau when working on their own. And so having someone who is an expert in the SAT or ACT or both can really help them to understand what are the kinds of mistakes they're making. Are they running out of time? Should they be approaching certain things differently? How should they be using Desmos, the built-in calculator? All of those kinds of strategies and meta strategies that an expert can help them figure out how they can break through to get to their score goal. So while generative AI can be really helpful in this process, there's so many cases where it is really useful for students to have a human in their corner for this process. And with that, I would love to open it up for Q&A. So if anyone has questions, please post them in the chat and we will go through them in the order that we get them. I will start us off with a question. Rachel, what did high school Rachel write her Common App essay about or personal statement?
Well, thanks for the question, Kim. I wrote about a hospitalization that I had. I had a health issue come up when I was a junior in high school. And the essay was this very long metaphor comparing this scar I got from the surgery to a newborn baby, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense in retrospect, but that's okay. However, I do think it was a nicely written essay. Like, I do think the writing quality in it was nice. And I also think it was a rather large missed opportunity and more insight that I could have shared. What about you, Kim? What did you write your essay topic about?
A good question. I wrote mine about doing the New York Times crossword. I was and actually still am really into crossword puzzles. I remember using the term word nerd, which I thought was really clever at the time. And that was in my college essay.
I love that. Do you still
Yeah.
consider yourself a word nerd in addition to doing puzzles?
Still a word nerd, yeah. Going strong. Now I do the crossword with my husband, so it's a fun shared activity for us.
Oh, that's so wholesome. What about your time taking the SAT? Like, I we all had to take it because it was required and is becoming more required now as with each new application season. Um, what do you remember that process and how it went for you and like what you learned and what you would do differently if you could go back?
Yes, that's a great question. So I remember having prep books. Like I think I had a big Kaplan book and a Princeton Review book. And I remember just doing a lot of practice tests because I think I got advice from people that you should take a lot of practice tests and keep doing that. Um, and so I think I spent, hours and hours taking practice tests. I ended up actually getting a perfect score on my SAT. But fun fact, you can get questions wrong and still get a perfect score because there are experimental questions included that don't get scored. So I'm pretty sure I got at least one or two questions wrong, but still got a perfect score. Um, but my main learning, I would say, from preparing for the SAT then, which, I would advise students to do very differently, is to not spend as much time taking full length tests. Full length tests are really great to get your initial baseline and to check progress and closer to the exam. But I would say it's much better once you have that baseline and you do those check-ins um, to actually just do targeted practice or like question sets versus like full 2.5 hour tests because you'll get a lot more bang for your buck that way. We have a question in the chat for you, Rachel, which is, do you suggest using AI for essay polish?
Yes, and thank you for the question, Lee. I had this in one of the slides. I do think that it's better not to use AI to polish your essays or to edit your essays because it makes the essays all sound the same. In other words, it's really easy for the student's voice to get lost when you use AI in basically making the essay sound nicer. I think it's actually a safer bet to leave it a little bit less polished, and so that the reader knows that the essay wasn't polished by AI.
And then,
Um, yes, question for Kim. Do you have classes for SSAT for applying to private high schools?
great question. I do not personally offer a class for the SSAT, or at least not yet, but I definitely have colleagues from the National Test Prep Association who do offer that. So I would be happy, Lee, after this, to suggest some folks who you could connect with for that. There's some really great SSAT prep courses and tutors out there. Any other questions? And thank you everyone for joining us on a Sunday evening. It was really great having you all here. I guess I have one more question for you, Rachel.
Yeah.
Oh,
Sure.
um, we have one in the chat, and then I'll ask you my question if we have no other questions. How many times do you suggest to take the SAT or no more than 5 times? Um, Typically, I will recommend that students not take the SAT more than about 3 times. I find that students often end up with the best scores taking it 2 to 3 times because most schools will allow score choice, so choosing which scores that you send, as well as super scoring, which allows you to combine, the best sections from each test for your highest overall score. Um, and as a result, like it can be very beneficial to take the SAT more than once. But I would say more than like 3 or 4 times, you end up getting diminishing returns. Um, and that is time that I think is better spent on some of the things that Rachel chatted about. So writing your personal statement, visiting colleges, working on supplemental essays that are very important as well. So I think my rule of thumb is probably not more than 4 times, but I find students often take it 2 to 3 and get great results that way.
Love that. Thanks for the question, Lee.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm happy to answer your question, Kim, if folks are willing to hang around for that.
Yeah, do you have any fun anecdotes about I would say like the bad and the ugly of AI in college essays? Any?
Oh, wow. Um, the bad and the ugly. I don't have any like super fun anecdotes about AI, I don't think, in the essay, other than sometimes I will read something and say to a student very directly, like, this sounds rather similar to something that ChatGPT would write. I would really suggest rewording it.
Mm-hmm.
Rewording this sentence, this paragraph. Um, I will also say, like, some of the best essays that I have read have been about topics that, again, like, sound kind of not that interesting when I summarize the essay, but then you read the essay and you just see like how beautifully the student wrote it, in terms of the student's command of English, just written English, as well as the student's ability to overcome obstacles. I had one kid write an essay about um, something rather dramatic happening in her family where her parents had a split and she had to move somewhere new with her mom. Um, and it was a hard time for her. This happened during high school, and so it explained a dip in her grades during that time. But more importantly, it also showed, she wrote about the role of reading literature and helping her overcome these struggles and the lessons that she took away from reading Jane Austen, which is a pretty famous English author. And to read Jane Austen for fun as a high school student is a kind of an uncommon thing to do. Um, it's a very intellectual thing to do. And she was taking these lessons from books that she was reading and applying them to her own life and showing that in her essay. And I thought that was really moving. Um, so that's just an example. Hopefully that's helpful of just like something that feels very personal to a student, that can make for a good essay topic. I will also say that the best essays are written by students who are really excited to write that essay topic. I think I framed that very poorly. But if a student is really excited to talk about what their essay is about, then they're almost certainly going to be excited to write about that essay, and therefore it will be more fun to read that essay, as opposed to the student finds it a drag to write about or talk about the essay and write about it. It's going to be not fun for the reader to read the essay.
That makes sense. And that does sound really interesting and unique to read Jane Austen for fun as a high schooler. I love that.
Yeah, she's a good kid. Very, very driven academically.
All right. Any more questions? If not, then we will probably end shortly. Thank you, everyone, for joining.
Thank you all so much. You can visit our websites at the links that are on the screen, um, getsharp.app or prosperaed.co, not .com. But thank you all for coming and joining us tonight.
Thank you. Bye.